war itself was a result, this you won't need to know because it has to do more with European stuff, but shifts in the balance of power that had existed within Europe itself, and the kind of alliance systems that existed that had become ossified. But you should know how it affected the United States, how initially America profited quite handsomely from it, how America had striven to stay out of that war until after the election of 1916, at which point Woodrow Wilson had decided that it was worthwhile to get involved in the war. Some of the incidents that are associated with having triggered it include the bombing of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram. But more important was his initiative to put into effect his 14 points. This was a vision of a new world order that he wanted to create, the centerpiece of which would be the League of Nations. You should be aware of the kind of societal changes that happened within the United States as it entered the war, suppression of civil liberties that had occurred, movements of African Americans into industrialized centers in the Northeast and Midwest, the role of women as well in being involved in production. You should be aware of how the United States was really instrumental in winning that war for the Allies, that one it was instrumental in winning. And also how quickly it ended, and the sense of disillusionment that followed in American culture after that war. We then spoke in a subsequent lecture about the 1920s and the emergence into the Great Depression. 1920s were an age of prosperity for the United States overall. The automobile would be primarily responsible for fueling that prosperity at this time and the other industries that are associated with it. But we also, by this point in time, had the radio. The radio was the major form of communication for Americans, how they would get their news and entertainment. That there was a fair amount of disillusionment amongst intellectuals at the time during this time of prosperity, changes that were happening in family lives, the rise of companionate marriage, and that this prosperity came abruptly to an end on Black Tuesday, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression. It was, you don't need to know this, but it's October 29th, 1929. You should know some of the causes of the Great Depression. You should know how it is still remains a contentious issue. Some of the causes include that America had not diversified sufficiently in the kinds of goods that it was producing. New technologies hadn't come into their own, that there was a maldistribution of wealth that existed within the society, so that the poor were not sufficiently well-heeled to purchase. Also, the rickety credit structure that existed internationally and domestically, as well as monetary policy. The raising of interest rates was believed to have been something that contributed to it. You should know the kinds of cultural effects that were brought about by the Great Depression. This weakened families substantially. Men would leave. Women oftentimes were working in pink ghetto jobs. And yet we had tremendous escapism during the Great Depression. We get soap operas, we get superheroes, we get Disney and the like, all of which, relatively speaking, were healthy manifestations Politically, what we got as a result of the Great Depression was the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president and his New Deal. You should know something about Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a president, that he was elected 4 terms for office, for instance, that he's the president that had led the United States through the Great Depression and World War II. You should understand that through his New Deal reforms, he had created a solid coalition of voters who would be Democrat. The coalition included African Americans, it included blue-collar workers, those who were in the South and the West, all of whom, through New Deal reforms, had gotten some benefits. You should be able to identify a couple of New Deal reforms. Social Security is perhaps the most notable that remains with us today. We then spoke about the circumstances that gave rise to World War II and America's involvement in that war. Just comparing it with World War I, the casualties within it were far greater. We had lost 8 million people in World War I. It was over 50 million people in World War II. The events that contributed to it included the Great Depression itself. That's one of the contributing factors, for instance, that had given rise to Hitler in Germany. That led to the aggressiveness of the Japanese as they were colonizing Manchuria in China. And the unwillingness of the United States, Great Britain, and France to get into another war. They did not want to have a repeat of World War I. There was a policy of appeasement. In the United States, we had the Neutrality Acts in place to try to ensure that the United States wouldn't get involved in another war. You should be aware of the escalating of hostilities that was drawing the United States into it. The fall of France in 1940 obviously is something that was duly noted by the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was taking measures at that time to prepare the United States to enter war and to support Great Britain, like the Lend-Lease Agreement. But you should be aware that it wasn't until the bombing of Pearl Harbor that the United States actually did enter the war. And then it was Germany that declared war against the U.S. You should note that the United States, how it waged it, was in the early days in the European front, primarily in Northern Africa. Most of the United States' energies were focused on the Pacific theater because the U.S. was waging that by itself. If you know a couple of details of how that war was fought, the two-pronged strategy, as we had Nimitz, who was heading westward from Hawaii, and MacArthur, who was heading northward from Australia, things like that. That would help if you knew something about how it was actually fought. You should be aware of how that war had shaped America economically and culturally. That it was World War II that had in fact brought about an end to the Great Depression. That we had unrivaled governmental spending at that point in time. Much of the investment was in military equipment, and among the most significant historically was the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. That within the U.S., while there was virtually full employment because everybody needed to work during World War II, that people couldn't spend their money that they needed to save because everything was being rationed, everything was going towards the war effort. And